Our lecture this evening is by Dr. Katie Liddane. Katie works for the Town and Weir Building Preservation Trust. Before that, she did her PhD on the witch prosecution in the northeast of England from 1642 to 1675. She'll talk a little bit about her work at the moment. She's working on a small building at the moment called Economies Hospital, which some of you might be aware of. It will take up a lot of our work in the next 2 years. So very warm welcome to Katie.
Thank you for inviting me to give a lecture. This is based on the first chapter of my thesis, but as it's my first time speaking to the Society and even the first time meeting many of you, I thought I'd begin with a bit of a personal academic introduction. So my academic background is that I began with a bachelor's in history at Northumbria University with a dissertation focused on the intersections between gender and class in early 20th century revolutionary Ireland. My interest in gendered crime continued into my postgraduate studies with an MRes in Cultural and Heritage Management funded by the Arts and Heritage Council, studying interpretations of Crossbones Graveyard in Southwark, London, and its links to sex worker heritage. Then my PhD, entitled Bewitching the Northeast, The History and Heritage of Witch Persecution in the Northeast of England, 1642 to 1675, was born out of a curiosity about how I had lived in the Northeast for around 7 years at that time, but had not heard that the region had the largest hanging for witchcraft in English history. As for current projects and research, as Don mentioned, I currently work as Heritage and Engagement Officer at Town and Weir Building Preservation Trust, particularly on Kilman's Hospital. You might have seen some articles recently about the funding being approved. But I'm also still involved in lots of witchcraft-related projects, including a lottery-funded engagement project with Broadside Creatives in Sunderland, research into the even more obscure Gateshead witch trials, and plans for a memorial for the Newcastle witches. I've had to cut the bit about the Gateshead witch trials from this lecture, so we're not here for several hours. But what I will say is I'm still in search of the remains of one of the Gateshead witches. She was found in 1999 between St Mary's Heritage Centre and what's now the Glass House, and her whereabouts are currently unknown. But I do have access to the Assizes records, at the very least, so I'm hoping to be able to match up the archaeological data we have about her with any glimpses of her life in the records. But if you are skilled in paleography to help me have a look at the records, that would be gratefully received. Or if for some reason you have any leads as to where she might be, also please come and find me. So to contextualize today's lecture, I wanted to provide a thesis summary. One of the aims of my thesis was to understand the comparative obscurity of the Newcastle trials within witchcraft scholarship and the wider and the local heritage landscape. Chapter 1 that today's talk is based on, through the analysis of surviving evidence in historiography, I found that the hunt did not align with established understandings of English witch trials, and that the minimum surviving direct evidence had precluded nuanced explorations of the phenomenon. These factors combined to reduce scholarly attention given to the witch hunt, especially in comparison to those in Pendle and East Anglia. But a witch hunt that appeared inexplicable through an Anglo-centric lens, however, became much easier to understand once its cross-border origins were revealed. The large outbreak and its satellite accusations hold the potential to further challenge binary understandings of English and Scottish witchcraft and witch belief. Chapter 2 extended this argument, but this time focused on the Derwent Valley witchcraft accusations of 1673. Often these accusations are known as the Anne Armstrong accusations because a teenage servant girl called Anne Armstrong was at the centre. But what is often left out is that 3 grown men from surrounding villages supported her testimony. So in the journey between the accusations being made in the 17th century through to the present, Anne's role has been affected by gendered interpretations. Chapter 3 followed the cases into the 19th century when they started to re-emerge as historical subject matter rather than a contemporary concern. I looked at the Newcastle trials and the Derwentdale accusations, reappearance in newspapers, antiquarianism, short stories, and folklore collections. This is where we see the consolidation of Anglo-Scottish binary approaches to understanding witch hunting, with romantic nationalism playing a significant part. Chapter 4 looked at the representation of especially the Newcastle witch trials in popular fiction, tracking the sudden resurgence of interest in the North East witch trials in popular culture. In Chapter 5, deindustrialisation and re-enchantment, I analysed how the local heritage industry in the region had formed in a post-industrial context that didn't create an environment hospitable to talk about witchcraft. So whereas in Salem, as soon as deindustrialisation started to happen, capitalisation upon the witch hunting past came hand in hand. So the earliest Salem witch trials merchandise was in the 1840s and came in the form of souvenir spoons and hand cream. But yeah. I don't have time to go into chapter 5 today, but the argument was essentially that the immediate focus on industrial nostalgia and the emphasis on community through hardship doesn't really match up with understanding a witch hunt and how a community turns in upon itself in times of crisis. So before I begin analysing the Newcastle witch hunt, I wanted to provide a summary of it and a kind of rundown of events. So a petition was submitted to the Common Council in 1649, requesting a Scottish witchfinder be invited into the town to identify witches. Around 30 people were brought forward to be examined by the witchfinder in Newcastle's Guildhall. This witchfinder was seen as especially skilled because he said that he could identify witches by sight alone. So of the 30 that were brought forward, 27 people were selected by the witchfinder and examined, and 15 in total were identified as having devil's marks, but no confessions were made at any point in the trial. Devil's marks were seen as the physical evidence of the witch's pact with the devil and the teat from which the familiar spirit would feed. In Scotland and in exceptional instances in England, these marks were tested by a pricker via the insertion of a medical pin. The logic being that if the mark bled, it was just a natural mark, like a wart, a mole, or a skin tag. But if it did not bleed, it was being protected by the devil. The Newcastle witchfinder was later exposed as a fraud because he was found to be using a pin that retracted into the handle. So to the rest of the court, it looked as though the pin was going into the person's flesh, but it wasn't. It was just going inside the handle instead. But as an evidentiary standard for witch trials at the time, this would have been very powerful because it's something that you could display in court rather than spectral evidence where you would just be giving testimony that a woman turned into a bear, a horse, a cow, and a dragon, as is the case with a man from a Northumberland witch trial. You can see this evidence before your eyes. Defendants were then tried at the summer assizes, where they were convicted. Isabel Brown, Margaret Madsen, Anne Watson, Eleanor Henson, Elizabeth Dobson or Robson, Matthew Bonner or Bulmer, Mrs. Elizabeth Anderson, Jane Hunter, Jane Coupling, Margaret Brown, Margaret Muffet, Catherine Walsh, alias Coulter, Alice Hume and Mary Poots were convicted. And on the 21st of August 1650, they were hanged on the town moor, alongside Jane Martin, a convicted witch from Northumberland, and 9 moss troopers. This was one of the worst, if not the worst, witchcraft outbreak in England, per Peter Rushton in Crazes and Quarrels. And while Malcolm Gaskell notes that 2 groups of 18 witches were hanged in Chelmsford in 1645, these executions did not take place on the same location or the same day. It was between the witchfinder's identification of the 14 people and the 15 people in their trial at the assizes that he was exposed as a fraud. And from the main source that we have, if we believe it, he was then pursued into Scotland, tried and executed himself. but that's whether we believe it, because another part that I've had to cut out of this talk for time was my attempt to identify the Newcastle witchfinder, and I wasn't able to cross-reference that with any executions of a witchfinder in 1650. So as has been the case with other exposed witchfinders, it was more likely that he was told not to do it again and allowed to carry on. So transforming 13,000 words of a chapter into a 45-minute talk has proven a challenge, but I've broken the chapter down into 4 parts. It's especially difficult because this chapter was full of really interesting stuff. So I've had to cut out a plagiarized pamphlet that mentions an animated beheaded bear, my theory on the identity of the Newcastle witchfinder, and as I said before, the missing skeleton of a Gateshead witch. So alongside the original introduction to the chapter, I'll begin by providing context for both the relationship between England and Scotland in the 17th century and a wider understanding of witchcraft legislation in both countries. The following section, Superstition and Worship and Oppression in Government, Religion and Witchcraft in Newcastle, 1603 to 1649, provides a socioeconomic analysis of Newcastle and its surrounds in the years leading up to the witch hunt to establish a context for the invitation of a Scottish witchfinder into the town and why this had not occurred earlier. She is for the town's days she is, the Newcastle witch hunt of 1649 to 1650. The third part of this lecture re-examines the surviving evidence directly relating to the trials within the context of this Anglo-Scottish spiritual economy. And then a very brief conclusion, thankfully. So before we get started, I wanted to open with this quote from H.D. Eric Middlefort that dispels the idea of witch hunts as a panic or a craze. Not only do those terms misrepresent the position of witch belief in a 17th century worldview, but the terms craze and panic are especially inapplicable to the Newcastle trials. The trials were initiated by a formal petition that took months to be acted upon. A well-reputed professional witchfinder was sought for the task, and each defendant was convicted according to evidentiary standards and largely by standard legal practices. Though happening around points of crises, the witch trials are representative of what was thought to be reasonable and plausible amongst the ordinary people of the 17th century. Only 25% of those tried across the 16th and 17th centuries in England were found guilty and executed. Many were acquitted and some given lighter punishments in line with their lighter offences. As we will see, a witch trial was also costly to local communities and authorities in the period, meaning that it wasn't carried out as a knee-jerk reaction. The early 17th century was a tumultuous period for the northeast of England and the nature of witchcraft persecution in England as a whole. 1603 saw the union of the crowns with the accession of James VI of Scotland and First of England, which, in practical terms, meant a greater focus on establishing order in the border regions. More than a strategic position from which to defend the nation from invading Scottish forces, the nearby town of Newcastle was protected as a vital contributor to England's economy through its coal trade and ports. The power wielded by those in control of the town was not lost on either English or Scottish elites, with the northeast becoming a key battleground at various points in the 17th century. However, while the town defended against military attacks north of the border, its population was regularly supplemented by cross-border migration, and we have records of regular trade across the border. This complex relationship with Scotland significantly shaped the region's culture and manifested itself particularly strongly in the 1649 to 1650 Newcastle witch hunt. As Pete Rushton states, the northeast was a border area more than geography. Newcastle was a regional economic centre that straddled nations with differing witchcraft ideologies, a hub for cross-border criminal enterprise, and a key to the spread of Scottish news into England. The history of crime in the border counties reveals why cross-border cooperation was a growing necessity, but also demonstrates the permeability of the border prior to James's reign. Travel across the border for both work and as a means of escape from punishment demonstrates that the border was a firm but not impenetrable barrier, used to meet the needs of ordinary people in both countries. Alongside the trade in material goods between the two countries, this close cross-border relationship brought with it a heightened interest in events in the bordering regions, including the spread of religious ideas and stories of witchcraft. While the spiritual economy, a shared network of beliefs, created a context in which the character of witch persecution in the northeast of England was influenced by both English and Scottish events. The idea of a spiritual economy is taken from Mark A. Peterson here in his book, The Price of Redemption, The Spiritual Economy of Puritan New England from 1997. And the phrase as it pertains to witchcraft is used by Peterson to describe the allocation of scarce resources, but also the elements within a broader organization of a society. The term in this chapter expands to incorporate the sharing of these spiritual elements across national borders. So I've included here a timeline of English witchcraft legislation. And as you can see, the 16th century saw some changes, such as greater leniency under Elizabeth, meaning that only harmful magic was a capital offence. Therefore, acts of divination, fortune-telling, or love magic were punished only by acts of penance. A crucial difference as we move into the 17th century is the shift towards secular rather than ecclesiastical courts for the trials, and a greater focus on familiar spirits. Several of the people accused in the northeast through the 17th century were said to have familiar spirits. And furthermore, the previous tiered system of offences was removed, and witchcraft in itself became a capital offence. To compare, Scotland saw legal and ecclesiastical concerns regarding witchcraft develop at a later point than in England. But when these concerns did develop, they took on a more serious character, even with those who consulted witches being included as targets of punishment. Witchcraft was also an exceptional crime, necessitating the burning of the body rather than execution by hanging, as was done in England. Crucially again, for an Anglo-Scottish lens on the Newcastle witch trials, the 1563 Act was ratified in 1649, the year of a national outbreak in accusations in Scotland and the year that the petition for a witch hunt was delivered in Newcastle. The 1604 Witchcraft Act, an act against conjuration, witchcraft, and dealing with evil and wicked spirits, empowered local authorities to execute those accused of divination alongside those accused of murder by witchcraft. But the act did not prompt a sudden and consistent campaign of persecution. Except in the Lancashire outbreaks of 1612 and 1634, it would not be until the 1640s and in East Anglia and Essex that persecutions peaked. The English Civil Wars and the widespread fear and decentralisation of government they brought are argued by Malcolm Gaskill to be responsible for this sudden rise. From this perspective, the significance of the Act in later witch hunts in the first half of the 17th century is complex, with the renewed vigilance following new legislation no longer providing an explanation for rising accusations, but the same legislation was used to secure those convictions. Neither the 1604 Act nor the period in which witch hunting peaked in England provide a complete explanation for individual accusations of witchcraft. Observations of these broader shifts suggest why accusations made it to court when they did, but shed little light on the nature of the claims. The role of local folklore, gossip, and reputation ensured that the origins of such allegations stretched beyond the context of war and changes in local authorities. Examining the wider character of the region in this period, in combination with political shifts, therefore provides a more comprehensive image of how accusations developed and resulted in execution. So just to explain the minimal evidence base that scholars who do look into the Newcastle trials are greeted with, the most detailed source we have is a small section in Ralph Gardner's England's Grievances Discovered in relation to the coal trade, and that was published 5 years after the executions. It's based on 3 witness accounts, and the coverage was heavily shaped by both the witnesses and Gardner's own grievances with Newcastle's hostman. His complaint is not necessarily with the idea of a witch trial. He is more using the Newcastle witch trials as an exhibit of local authorities' corruption. He takes a special umbrage with the fact that a Scottish witchfinder was invited into the town. Aside from Gardner's later coverage, and what we do know of the petition from Common Council records, prior court appearances of one of the accused in the quarter sessions, combined with details included in St Andrew's burial register, to establish a slightly more well-rounded understanding of the individual cases that made up the cluster, or the larger witch hunt. We also have the pamphlet Wonderful News from the North here by Mary Moore. And this covers the accusations made against Jane Martin, who was the convicted witch from Northumberland, executed alongside the Newcastle witches. So as this was published around the same time and in close geographical proximity to the Newcastle trials, we can use that to speculate on the specific acts of witchcraft that the defendant would have been accused of. So from this limited selection of sources, we then see a kind of repeated minimal representation of the North East witch trials in the historiography. So difficulties in understanding the Newcastle witch hunt stem partially from viewing the cluster of accusations either in isolation or in a solely English context. And the kind of view of them in isolation, I believe, comes from the minimal surviving evidence. But accepting its brief inclusion in broader regional histories and witchcraft studies, Peter Rushton's 1983 article, Crazes and Quarrels, for which the late Peter Rushton hand scanned his typewritten copy from 1983 for me. It was the only way that I could get hold of it. So I'm very grateful to have that. And I now send that out to other scholars trying to get hold of a copy. And Jo Bath's discussion within her 2008 chapter, The Treatment of Potential Witches in North East England, 1649 to 1680, the Newcastle witch hunt has received little scholarly analysis. When it is explored, the outbreak is seen as representative of an attempt to stabilise a localised power struggle. And this proves an unsatisfactory explanation because it fails to explain the nature and timing of the outbreak. It remains limited by the binary approach to English and Scottish witchcraft ideologies, and it does not consider the wider context of witch belief in surrounding areas. Roger Howell Jr. and Peter Almer, for example, both attribute the genesis of the trials to religious and political upheaval within the town itself. But as Rushton notes, the extent of upheaval in terms of its impact on the leadership of Newcastle is questionable. In fact, some of the officials presiding over the Newcastle witch trials in 1649 to 1650 also oversaw the 1673 Derwentdale Valley accusations. So that's kind of an impressive amount of longevity. And although the politics of the region changed throughout the Civil War period, the wealthy families that were present were able to retain their positions. This Anglo-centric context has its legacy in the division between English and Scottish witch hunting within witchcraft historiography in a wider sense. We can go back further to look at the strong nationalist component in 18th and 19th century historicizations of witch persecution, presenting Scotland as rugged and savage and therefore more prone to witch hunting, and wanting to establish that strong contrast with England. But we can date a similar disjuncture between English and Scottish witchcraft historiography to the late 20th century. James Sharp posits that a scholarly emphasis on the differences between English and Scottish witch hunting was solidified in Christine Larner's response to Keith Thomas and Alan McFarlane's anthropological explanations for English witchcraft. The Thomas McFarlane thesis, based on a study of Essex and stating that witchcraft accusations emanated lodged from village tensions and interpersonal disputes, came to be understood as representative of witchcraft in England as a whole. As Sharp writes of Larner's 1981 book, Economies of God, the text put forward a radically different image of witch hunting in Scotland. Linking the increasing witch persecution with state formation, Larner's thesis saw a return from a return to from above approaches to witchcraft studies. Building upon a longer legacy of separation, the adoption of such contrasting approaches continued to obscure the potential for cross-fertilization of witch belief between the two nations. With Rushton's article being published just 2 years after Lana's book, it becomes clear why Rushton was hesitant to ascribe Scottish influences to the Northeast outbreaks. This juxtaposition of Lana's work against that of the Thomas Macfarlane thesis, both works being subject to criticism in decades since, saw ideological and theological divisions mapped neatly onto national borders. Though Sharp in his 2002 chapter suggested that research into the intermingling of English and Scottish witch belief would be best done on a comparative basis, the proximity of the northeast of England to the Scottish border also allows for this research to be done using a regional study. Noting the influence of French demonologist Jean Baudin, Lucinda Cole uses this comparison between rats and witches' ability to, quote, attract poison from the air and infection from the air to evidence her thesis that naturalistic and theocentric explanations of contagion coexisted and even blurred together. Cole maintains that if sorcerers and witches are not the only cause of plague with the devil, they are its first victims and the source of subsequent contamination. Although, rather than witches being the direct cause of the plague by using their demonic powers to infect those around them, we see an understanding that the plague and witchcraft were linked in a more abstract sense. The spread of a devastating disease was seen as a punishment from God for earthly authorities' inaction of a widespread social and religious disorder. In Newcastle's 1636 outbreak, Dr. Jennison explicitly connects morality and contagion with the line, "The plague on the heart and soul brings God's plague upon the body." A closer reading of his concern for the town's souls establishes the context under which its inhabitants would seek to scapegoat witches just over a decade later. Though he does not directly mention witchcraft, his references to idolatrous women of old are indicative of prevalent misogyny and anti-Catholicism that would see witch persecution rise in the coming decades. So, alongside an increased focus on sin, the practicalities of life during the plague also may have contributed to the reputations of witchcraft, as poorer women had active roles in managing the outbreak. As Keith writes and notes, women fulfilled the roles of keepers and cleansers, who would care for the sick and clean the homes of decedents, and searchers, whose job it was to search the sick for signs of plague. These women drew suspicion and even resentment from surviving members and family members and neighbours, with court records mentioning these poor women being taken to court because they were left items in the wills of people that they had cared for. With the petition being submitted 13 years later, the women named by Wrightson, or women like them, may have been among those tested by the witchfinder and tried at the assizes. Tracing the mounting suspicions this far back would prove difficult, as often these build-ups of resentment and reputation would not make it to written record. But the longer-term consequences of the plague conceivably contributed to the development of these reputations of those ultimately convicted. That a witch hunt did not occur close to the epidemic, however, suggests that other factors were at play when the petition for a witchfinder was delivered. Johann Dillinger notes, witch hunts and plagues were more tangentially linked than directly connected. Epidemics were likely to generate social tensions that brought about larger scale witch hunts, rather than witches being suspected of causing the initial sickness. Newcastle's plague, though devastating, occurred before witch hunting would peak in either England or Scotland, and despite such destruction, the recovery of the town's population figures was remarkably quick. Andy Byrne notes again that the number of baptisms in the town had completely recovered by 1639, and that there were 500 infants being baptised per year for the next decade. Employment drew workers to the region from both sides of the border, helping the population to recover, but also changing its composition to reflect its proximity to Scotland. Therefore, while Jennison's text touched on adjacent concerns about spiritual contagion, these concerns did not readily translate into a more organised witch hunt. but they did lead to greater Scottish cultural influence in the town. The plague would, however, be quickly followed by further hardship. So the peace following the union of the crowns came to an end when Charles I sought to impose Church of England practices upon the Church of Scotland. The signing of the National Covenant in opposition to these measures formally reignited tension between the two countries. In 1640, part of the Second Bishops' War, Scottish Covenanters who had sympathisers in nearby Sunderland invaded the town in response to Scottish ships being denied English ports. Following the Battle of Newburn, a village close to Newcastle, the Scottish army descended upon the town. Hearing of the losses at Newburn, both the army and many of the civilian inhabitants of the town had evacuated. It later cost Newcastle's authorities £28,000 to fund the army's occupation, a kind of payment so the town wouldn't be ransacked. This was then recouped through taxation and was followed by further social disorder when the army left. Though Matthew Greenhall is hesitant to describe the tax increase as evidence for hardship for the region, the displacement of its populace and the accompanying increase in crime along the border is suggestive of the types of social disorder that contributed to witch hunting this period. In fact, Greenhall continues to include reports from Jedburgh noting slaughter, depredations, the breaking of ministers' houses, witchcraft, charming, and other odious crimes in the months following the army leaving. Although the Northeast wouldn't experience witch hunt at this time, we do see an increase in interest in witchcraft in the region and an ongoing association between socio-political and spiritual disorder. Reflections of the region's government and its role in national politics were heightened as the country entered into civil war. Newcastle, though a relatively small town, played a significant role in the English civil wars, both economically and as a strategic position close to the border. Nationally, the civil wars also brought with them challenges to social order and peacetime judicial practices, and this disruption manifested itself in an increase in witch trials, most famously in Matthew Hopkins' East Anglia. As Diane Purkis writes, for many, the renewed fervour for witch persecution was merely an extension of the war they were already fighting. The highly polarised battle seen by both sides as one between good and evil was easily mapped on to fears of witchcraft. With the spiritual material worlds being so closely connected, it is unsurprising that Newcastle's decades of hardship would ultimately culminate in a witch hunt. With these apocalyptic visions, such as those by William Lithgow here, talking about men lying as dead dogs in the street, the siege and occupation being akin to the brutality that facilitated Matthew Hopkins' activities in Essex, we must question again why the town's trials would not be initiated until years later. Financial costs relating to the series of crises may have also precluded a witch hunt at this time. It was £850 per day that was being paid by Newcastle authorities. And the kind of financial consequences of the most recent siege and occupation would have also contributed towards this. In Scotland, there are cases of the husband of a woman being executed for witchcraft being made to pay for the cost of the execution. So itemised bills of the wood that was used for the pyre, etc. The occupation also drove up Scottish migration to the town, again demonstrating the impact of the bordering nation on the makeup of Newcastle itself. This sense of hostility between the armies of bordering countries, combined with civilian migration between the two, creates a complex foundation for the mixing of witchcraft belief. Also at this point, it's interesting to note that in the kind of middle of the 1640s, there's no large outbreak happening in Scotland either. So part 3, she is for the town says she is. This quote is taken from the Ralph Gardner account, and he alleges that this was said by the witch finder in response to objections made against the guilt of one of his test subjects. So this test subject is surely not a child of the devil because she is kindly and good-like. Oh, no, personable and good-like is the line.
have a drink.
So this part will look more closely at the direct evidence that we do have, and also look to compare the features of the Newcastle witch hunt with those happening in Scotland in 1649-1652. That was 1650, 2, not 1652. So after part 2 outlined the series of crises Newcastle experienced through the first half of the 17th century, we'd be forgiven for attributing the trials solely to these decades of unrest. Peter Elmer does just that with his judgment that the trials were inevitable by 1649 and were representative of localised crises and power struggle. He uses the uncertainty of the interregnum to argue that the socio-political context of the Civil War simply continued to affect Newcastle's petitioners into the interregnum. As we've seen in the previous part, there were several points in the decades prior that could and would have generated a witch hunt within Elmer's parameters, but it failed to appear. This sense of accumulating misfortune on a local level also does little to explain the nature of the witch hunt that followed. The details of the supposed panics, both sides of the border, point to a greater complexity than that of previous surges in accusations. In Scotland, for example, witchcraft accusations and confessions in this outbreak included an inversion of the covenant, so central to the political upheaval of the prior decade. The eradication of witchcraft formed such a large part of the Covenanters' vision of a godly society that 1649 saw, after 4 previous condemnatory acts against witches passed since 1640, the ratification of Scotland's 1563 Witchcraft Act. In practical terms, these acts saw the accusation of 557 people between 1649 and 1650, with concentrations occurring in Lothian, Strathclyde, and the East Borders. Both sides of the border, the trials in this period saw an increase in the use of pricking as a form of evidence. And though we do see prickers appear in Scottish records earlier in the 17th century, with John Balfour being active in 1632, for example, numerous prickers were active during the witch hunt of 1649-1650, and one clearly extended his career into the northeast of England. While we do not see witch hunting in Newcastle reach the same scale as in Scotland, the use of a Scottish pricker and well-established connections between the town and those north of the border suggests that the Newcastle witch hunt occurring during Scotland's national outbreak was more than a coincidence. The national outbreak comprised of a series of local hunts that spread into one another as accusations crossed parish, town, and county borders. With such a contagious air to the Scottish outbreak, it is not inconceivable that national borders too would be crossed. Alistair Henderson similarly addresses the spread of fears of witches beyond the local community in the years of national panic. This spread is especially the case in towns where the local economy was focused on trade. With Newcastle being a national centre for trade, increasingly so in the 17th century, we can apply this scenario to the town's own witch hunt. So comparing the features of the Newcastle witch hunt and the Scottish larger outbreak, we find that Newcastle adopted Scottish witch hunting methodology in detection methods in a time where there was a lack of fervour elsewhere in England. Around the same year, the Sheriff of Cumberland wrote to London requesting advice and assistance in carrying out their own witch trials. But the letter that returned was essentially, you've got the Witchcraft Act of 1604, get on with it. So we can see this divide between the North and London in terms of interest in witch trials. Where the origin of the Newcastle hunt is connected to events over the border, the request made for a Scottish witchfinder forms part of a broader history of petitioning for a witch hunt. Brian Levack's discussion of petitioning in Scotland is useful here in understanding the process and how Newcastle's own petition compares. While Levac notes that local authorities often petitioned the Privy Council to hold their own trials in Scotland in response to the build-up of accusations, the Newcastle petition was made to request a witchfinder, and it was after his arrival that the town's bellman was sent out to encourage accusations to be brought forward. According to Levac's comparison between the origin of larger-scale English and Scottish witch trials, the Newcastle outbreak acts as a hybrid between the two. Convictions were secured at the assizes, in line with English witch hunting, the local authorities having awaited the semi-annual visit rather than carrying out the trials themselves. But the petitioning of Newcastle's council resembles the common Scottish approach. This combined with the details that we do have of the petition is evocative of the cross-border influence over this particular witch hunt. From what we do know of the details of the petition, those who made it had specific demands and were eager to incentivise the witchfinder to cross the border. He was paid 20 shillings per witch that he could find guilty. Furthermore, the organisation and submission of the petition places the Newcastle outbreak further along in the timeline of a witch hunt upon the arrival of a witchfinder. So it's very likely that they already had an idea of who they'd like to try, and they just wanted to formalise the process with a man who was known to be an expert witchfinder. Rather than the disparate suspicions arising and being formalised at a particular point of crisis for the region, the petitioning process acts as an intermediary stage between suspicion and trial. Likely aware of the heightened period of witch hunting in Scotland, Newcastle's inhabitants sought a professional pricker or broader to rid their town of witches. The pricking of the devil's mark has been largely not factored into discussions of torture in witch hunting, and torture forms a central part in the argument to divide English and Scottish witch hunting processes. So torture was outlawed in the vast majority of English trials, but the definition of what counted as torture was quite slippery. So keeping a defendant awake for several days and tell them if they just confess they can go to sleep, that doesn't count as torture in the 17th century. So with torture being used as a key division between English and Scottish models of witchcraft, the use of pricking in the Newcastle witch hunt is particularly challenging. So interrogating torture as the basis of comparison between English and Scottish trials, Stuart MacDonald establishes a more precise definition of the practice by breaking down the definition of torture into 6 categories: judicial torture, the use of physical coercion such as thumbscrews to secure a confession; searches for a witch's mark; sleep deprivation, particularly harsh jail conditions; mob violence; and method of execution. Liv Helen Williamson argues that the latter 3 of MacDonald's categories are too general to be included under the definition of torture, but the combination of inducing physical pain and the public shame and humiliation involved in stripping the accused of their clothing in the courtroom brings us closer to an appreciation of how investigations of the Devil's Mark went beyond a mere search for evidence. Incorporating pricking into a broader understanding of torture, rather than simply as evidence gathering, allows us to reassess the role of torture in English witch trials more broadly, and also to determine the more prominent traces of Scottish influence behind the Newcastle witch hunt. Over the first half of the 17th century, we can trace the development of witchcraft ideology and investigative methodology that will secure a conviction of the Newcastle witches. The Anglo-Scottish dynamic at play here is particularly visible in one of the most influential witchcraft texts in the period, Richard Bernard's A Guide to Grand Jurymen. Bernard was an English Puritan clergyman. When his guide was published, he lived in Somerset. Building upon the guidance given in the 1604 Act, Bernard, amongst others, set out to standardise witch trial practices in England. The guide suggests an evidence-driven process to curtail what he saw as witch belief's potential to breed, quote, superstition and prevent proper legal redress. Though Julian Goodare and Brian Levac, for example, regard the pricking of the devil's mark as a largely Scottish phenomenon, we do see mention of pricking in Bernard's text. The hesitancy to accept the mark as proof is indicated by the qualifying statement that such marks may be, quote, natural and must therefore be pricked with a pin to determine whether they are, quote, insensible. Bernard's influence over later guides is also visible. With Michael Dalton's The Country Justice, too, we see Bernard's text used to prescribe pricking as it, quote, proves fully that those witches have a familiar and made a league with the devil. While we may not see much of an active use of pricking in witch hunts elsewhere in England, it did retain a presence in English witch hunting discourse. Here we see that those overseeing the trial process in Newcastle were abiding by guidance in use throughout the nation, but also taking influence from their northern neighbour. Overall, it is clear that the Newcastle witch trials do not fit neatly into established definitions of English or Scottish witchcraft ideology. Whilst both in the long and short term, the town and wider region were heavily influenced by their neighbours north of the border, it's especially interesting that the Newcastle witch trials retained peacetime English judicial practices too. Before we conclude, and as the lecture has been a much more analytical approach to the wider socio-political issues at hand, I wanted to take some time to discuss what little we do know about the people executed as a result of these accusations. For an example, Eleanor Dobson, or Robson or Rogerson, is also listed in the St Andrew's Burial Register as having stolen silver spoons. We see here a layering of accusations that is replicated in the region and beyond. This idea of a witch thief. The association between witchcraft and theft was common in cases of slander and in the construction of a criminal reputation, but may also indicate that Eleanor had been accused of using divination to find missing goods. The logic here, as Rushton notes, was that a quote-unquote witch would first steal and hide the objects and then have her clientele come to her to use magic to find them. Albeit speculative in nature, owing to the lack of survived material, this glimpse into the nature of one of the Newcastle accusations is indicative of the Newcastle witch hunt as a cluster of disparate accusations rather than a hunt prompted by fears of wider conspiracy, which is what we do see in the Derwentdale accusations of 1673. Notions of a covenant with the devil and various witches' Sabbaths, a plot for witches and demons to upturn society. This is what's absent in the Newcastle trials as far as we know. Matthew Bulmer, the only male defendant, appears in Quarter Sessions records as both defendant and plaintiff in a pair of petty disputes. While the nature of the offences in both cases is unclear, these appearances are indicative of a prior reputation that translated into a formal accusation with the appointment of a witchfinder. Matthew's listed as a smith. The final witch for which we have any more information is Margaret Brown. Margaret Brown's friend, Eleanor Lumsdale, who provided her account of the hangings to Ralph Gardner, spent a year in jail for attempting to deter people from giving evidence against her. It was also Brown who is said to have asked at the gallows for a sign from God to prove her innocence. Upon the platform dropping beneath the convicted, it is said that Margaret's blood sprayed across the crowd to their, quote, admiration. While the details relating to Matthew Bulmer and Eleanor Robson shed light on the accusations themselves, Eleanor Lumsdale's relationship with one of the executed shapes the only detailed account we have of the entire affair. So the following sentence of my conclusion alludes to other parts of my thesis that I've sadly run out of time to talk about. So I hope if you do want to know more that the Society will have me back to talk about them too. I think I could quite easily do an hour just on the pamphlet Wonderful News from the North. But with one of the worst, if not the worst, witchcraft outbreaks in England, the only confirmed midwife convicted for witchcraft in England, and an incredibly detailed and rare English account of the witches' Sabbath, the border region's legacy of witchcraft belief is remarkable, yet beyond the work of Rushton, Bath, and Levac, detailed scholarly analysis in this area is lacking. Where Rushton sought primarily to use the case to explain variations in the number of those accused in the region and its subsequent anomalous status in statistical diachronic analyses of English witchcraft persecution, this chapter looks more closely at the accusations themselves, the responses they received, and the wider societal impact of prior 17th century events. Rather than acting merely as an illustrative example of broader witchcraft or regional criminal histories, an analysis of the 1650 Newcastle witchcraft executions illuminates both the nuanced nature of the region's relationship with Scotland and the wider cross-fertilisation of English and Scottish witchcraft ideologies.